Hi class, Dr. Walton here, and it is week 5. You folks have killed it this term, and let's keep that momentum going. For our class today, we are going to do a little bit of a change of format. I want to follow the agenda, so I want to talk to you a little bit about week 4, but then I'm going to jump into a midterm review where we're going to cover all of the most important information from the first half of the course. That way, you will be ready to tackle the midterm exam itself, and you'll be prepared and know what to expect. So, as far as week 4 goes, all of your grading is in. I am getting plenty of feedback that grades don't seem to be updating. If you go in after the fact, or if I've offered you an extension on something, the grade isn't consistently updating to the grade book. So if you think the grade is wrong and it should be different, please send me a message, let me know, and I would be happy to look into it. It could just be a tech glitch. It could be something that I need to do on my end. I'm happy to take a look. I want to make sure you have an accurate vision of how you're doing in class. So let me know. And remember, there are way more of you than there are of me. So I can always use the extra help double checking what's going on in that grade book. So please, I would appreciate it. Now, as far as announcements go, nothing new or terribly shocking this week. Just a friendly reminder that if you scored poorly, because words, on a prior week exam or knowledge check, and you would like another opportunity to try it, please reach out. I am more than happy to offer all the extensions in the world, but you have to communicate with me. Same goes for discussion forums. If you missed out on any points for maybe not getting peer replies, or maybe you were too short, things like that, and you want to try it again, just got to ask. I am here for you, okay? We are preparing for the midterm, which means we've reached the peak of the class and we'll start rolling towards the end. And it becomes extra important for you to be aware of, on top of, and in sync with how you are doing in this class. We will have week 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I think, and then your final exam will be in the end half. So I want you to be prepared for that. If you have not done well in the first half, let's get you up to speed so that you can start the second half in a good place, okay? Way easier to catch up 1 or 2 weeks than 8, 9, or 10 weeks, right? So let me know what you need from me, all right? Okay, so today, as I mentioned, this lecture is going to be a midterm review. So I'm going to cover chapters 1, 3, 4, and 5. All of the slides are going to be the ones pulled from prior lectures. So you're going to see things you have already seen. You will hear me repeating information I've already said. It's important for you to understand that the reason we are talking about these key concepts is because they are the things I'm testing on. Now, if you have done well on your knowledge checks and on your quizzes, all of those same types of questions pull to the midterm exam, okay? So if you're doing great there, the midterm is probably going to be a lot of familiar stuff, a lot of things you've seen, and you should be pretty well prepared. But please, please, please take the time to review some of the concepts, especially from the early weeks of the class before you really got in the groove, okay? All right, so let's start here, and I'm gonna turn off my video. Let's start here with chapter 1. So in chapter 1, we had a couple of main points. Remember, communication is wicked important to your career success. I want you to know that communication helps us meet our goals, our strategic goals, our presentation goals, our relational goals, okay? I want you to remind yourself of the model of communication, which we'll go over. I want you to remember what noise is, especially as it relates to the model of communication. I want you to have an understanding of formal communications and informal networks. And remember, there are ethical considerations, okay? Those are the big pieces. So let's talk about it. Remember, communication is strategic. We are in this world to achieve some goals, and the likelihood of meeting those goals depends on your ability to participate effectively in a very diverse world. So, um, in order to be effective, you need to strategically communicate. You'll need to communicate to achieve several types of goals. Instrumental goals are those that help you accomplish tasks. Relational goals are goals which promote or impede your goals based on the relationship you have with other people. And your identity management or presentation goals. Your communication can help you or hurt you in how you present yourself to people around you. I want you to review the communication model. What does communication look like? Well, if I had to put it into a chart or an image, this is it. In its very simplest form, this is the communication model. You have a sender who encodes a message and sends the message via the channel to the receiver, who decodes the message, makes meaning out of it, and then replies or sends feedback. Now, in the middle, we have noise. What is noise? Anything that interrupts the signal, right? Anything that gets in the way of the message or the feedback, anything that cuts off the channel. Okay, there's lots of different types of noise. There's literal noise, like it's too noisy in here. There's psychological noise, as in I'm too stressed to focus on this conversation. There's physiological noise. I can't concentrate or hear you right now because I'm too hungry. Okay. So remember, noise is anything that interrupts the message. Now, when we're talking about communication at work, I want you to remember downward communication. This is from the top down. This is usually from a manager to employees. What we see with downward communication is that there's a lot of rules and policies and procedures that are sort of given to the employees from the boss, right? So that's the kind of communication that mostly happens in downward. It's directives, it's instructions, okay? The trick with downward communication is there's really no opportunity for feedback or like an exchange of information. That is not necessarily appropriate for this format of communication. There's also upward communication. This is when your lower level, like your ground level workers, communicate up to the boss. And usually that is to communicate the progress they're making, perhaps on a project, or maybe feedback on one of those policies that the boss sent down, right? A lot of companies say they want to hear from their employees at the bottom, and so they encourage upward communication, but really most organizations don't love it. It's considered a little undesirable. It can be really hard to be honest and straightforward, especially with dissatisfiers when you're communicating up, okay? It can be a little risky. And then we have horizontal communication, which is communication between people at the same level in the organization, like you and your coworkers, right? Horizontal or lateral communication. There's a few different things that are accomplished in horizontal communication. Things like coordinating tasks, sharing information, resolving conflicts, and building rapport, very important. Okay, so those three types of professional communication styles, networks, kind of models. Keep those in mind for your test. And then don't forget about the ethical piece of communication. Remember, I teach you the skills. I'm going to give you the superpowers, and you have to choose how you use it. So when you are communicating at work, and perhaps making decisions or disciplining employees or any number of situations, you have to remember a few of the approaches to it. So are you going to take a utilitarian approach, which provides the greatest good for the greatest number? Are you going to take a rights approach, which respects the moral rights of the employees or of the people? Are you going to take the justice approach, which is looking at the action and making sure it's free of discrimination or favoritism, things like that. Will you take the common good approach? Does the action further the common or community good? Are you going to take the virtue approach? Does this action promote the development of character in me and or my community? How about the professional ethic approach? If a third party or a jury of your peers were to judge you on your decision, how would the greater majority of them agree with you? Okay. And then the publicity test, I like this one. If this were printed in the paper, if the public had found out about it, how would you feel about it? Would you regret it? Okay. So the top, the approaches: utilitarian, rights, justice, common good, and virtue. These are all approaches to ethical communication. Most of them are put forth by famous philosophers. The bottom two, the professional ethic and the publicity test, are really good guidelines for you to judge whether what you're doing is an ethical behavior. Okay. So that's chapter 1. Now, we did that in like 8 minutes, reviewed the whole chapter. The original lecture was an hour. So there's definitely things in there that we didn't talk about, we didn't review again. These are the things I want you to focus on for the test, okay? All right, let's talk about chapter 3. What did we learn in chapter 3? Well, chapter 3 was a lot about some listening. Remember, listening to understand is the goal, but that requires a lot of things. You have to withhold judgment, you can't interrupt, you have to ask for feedback and ask good questions. But that is the goal. You want to listen to understand. You want to recognize faulty assumptions that are being made, and how those can hurt your ability to listen to understand. Remember that listening is the most frequently used activity at work. I want you to be aware of the different listening styles. Remember the barriers to being an effective listener, and I want you to remember that you have to evaluate the speakers you listen to. All right, so what's the importance of listening? Remember, listening helps us achieve every one of those communication goals we just discussed in chapter 1. The instrumental, the relational, the presentation goals, those are all achieved through good listening. And we know that employers want employees with really good communication skills, but we see that poor listening is one of the biggest things that challenges advancement. If you're a bad listener, you cannot be concise when you are giving or receiving feedback. You have a hard time giving critical or effective feedback as well. Things like, writing, motivating, interviewing, things like that, that's all feedback based. I want you to remember the process of listening. It covers a lot of states. Remember, you receive the information, then you interpret it, you evaluate it, and then you can respond to it. And then, of course, there's recall down at the bottom, your ability to pull up that information way after the fact, which shows you were really listening in the first place, okay? Remember, there are several types of listening. Not all listening is created equal. There is discriminative listening, which is where you are literally hearing. You are listening to focus and isolate. So you want to pick out the details. Maybe you're in a crowded diner and somebody's telling you a story. So you're going to do some discriminative listening so you can hear them over the loud noises around you. There's informational listening, listening to understand. That's where you are listening to comprehend information, to retain information. Things like sitting in a recorded lecture with Dr. Walton is an example of informational listening. There's also critical listening when you're analyzing the message, deciding, should I accept this? Should I reject this? Or do I need to wait and maybe get a little more information? Remember, part of the hallmark of higher education and sort of advancing your mindset is the ability to critically listen, to say, I'm not ready to respond to that. I need more time or information. Sounds like a cop-out perhaps, but it's actually the sign of a higher thinker. So take the time to critically listen. And of course, empathetic listening, the hardest, um, listening to feel, to understand the thoughts or the feelings that are going on with the other person that you're listening to. This one often takes the most amount of effort. Remember, there are various styles of listening. We talked a little bit about what kind of teacher I would be like if I took each of these approaches. Relational listeners are people oriented. They care about the needs and the feelings of the other person. So I believe in our example, we had someone who asked for an extension. Now, the relational teacher was more focused on how are you? How are you recovering? What do you need? And using a lot of emotional support. But that kind of overshoots the problem we're dealing with, which is the actual extension that the student requested. There's the critical listeners who are very, very action oriented. They like well organized, precise information. They get frustrated when somebody is going on and the information is perceived as long-winded or unorganized. Mostly when they're listening to you, they're trying to consider the action response, the plan that needs to happen to solve the problem. Okay. Oh, I remember that we used code words for each style listener. So let me go back a little bit. Relational listeners, we called them supporters. Critical listeners are builders, right? They build the solution. Okay. All right, analytical listeners are very content oriented. They like complex messages. They want all the perspectives to make the decision. They are very, very evaluative. These folks would be considered learners, right? They're going to ask a billion questions before they give a response. And then, of course, task oriented listeners, very timely, time oriented, time concerned. They have goals to get to. They don't need anything besides what is relevant to the moment. They don't want to hear the extras. They tend to cut people off. They make quick judgments. These are our executives. Each listening style has a place. There's no good or bad. There's just good and bad application of these listening styles. You want a task-oriented listener as the boss. I got 5 minutes. I have a decision that has to be made. The effects of this decision are huge. It will make or break 100 people's jobs, and it will cost or benefit the company $100 million. You got 5 minutes, go. Task-oriented listeners, love it. They're great there. Analytical listeners, they could never do it in that amount of time. Okay. Relational listeners probably would never be able to come to a decision because they'd be worried about the people that would be impacted and their lives and all of that stuff. Critical listeners, oof, that one's iffy. They could probably do a good job, but I'll bet that the time constraint would be too much for them. So remember the listening styles. Okay, chapter 4. What did we cover in chapter 4? Do you guys remember? I'll tell you. We talked a lot about verbal and nonverbal communication. Remember, verbal messages can be concrete. They are the clearest when they're concrete, I should say. When you are unequivocal, when you limit your slang, your jargon, your disfluencies. Remember that language choice and bias terms, inflammatory terms, those things, they make a difference on how your language is received. Remember, there are masculine and feminine communication styles. That doesn't mean men and women. That means masculine and feminine, right? Understand the difference in the goals. Remember that nonverbal communication is absolutely unavoidable. It is multi-channeled. You take nonverbal in through every single one of your senses, and when in doubt, match intensity. So those are our main points for chapter 4. Let's break them down a little further. Okay, Verbal communication, very important, and it's a big piece of conflict management. Remember that conflicts happen. They're always going to happen. And they happen especially when we see perceived or real incompatible goals or opposing viewpoints. Think about how two people can interpret the same message very, very differently. Even the simplest of messages can be misunderstood, but don't mistake conflict for quality. We know that conflict is not always negative or unproductive. And in fact, there are several research studies which tell us quantity of conflict is not nearly as important as how the conflict is handled. Okay. You need to be prepared to handle conflict in your personal and professional relationships. Now, nonverbal communication is a little bit different. In nonverbal communication, we have a lot larger opportunity for error, okay? Now, remember, nonverbal communication sort of is the right brain piece of the communication puzzle. The left brain is verbal. It's the words, it's logistics, it's grammar, it's mechanics, it's punctuation, right? Nonverbal is emotion, tone, rate, speed, right? So nonverbal communication is incredibly powerful and generally holds a lot more weight than a verbal message. The involuntary nature of nonverbal communication makes it super hard to fake. So when you are presented with a verbal message and a nonverbal message, and those two things don't match, you tend to believe the nonverbal. I believe I gave you this example in the live session, but I'll give it to you again. Remember, when you come home and you see your significant other and they look just like they had the hardest day ever, and you say, how was your day? And they say, it's fine. Okay, well, the words said it was fine. The nonverbals said hard day at work. Which do you believe more? Nonverbal. If you stick to just what the words say, I'll bet you get in a lot of communication problems, okay? Remember that nonverbal communication is multi-channeled. I think your textbook says something like 90% of the meaning of words comes from nonverbal communication. We put a lot of weight on it. It's a big piece of who we are, and so it affects your success in your career. But it also varies from culture to culture. Remember, some cultures appreciate direct eye contact, some do not. It's really up to you to understand the culture you're communicating with before you start communicating with them. And don't forget that nonverbal communication is one of the best ways we can express our identities. Think about the way you set up your cubicle at work or the way you decorate your house, even the clothes you wear, your tone of your voice, your accent, your jewelry, all of that expresses your identity, and all of those things fall under nonverbal communication. Okay, we are to chapter 5. I hope you guys are taking notes and keeping up with me. Let's talk about chapter 5. So in chapter 5, we talked about interpersonal skills. Our interpersonal communication skills are super essential for a successful career. Your skills working with people are going to help create positive relationships. It's going to keep your career, your organizational climates healthy. I want you to understand the difference between IQ and EQ. Remember, IQ is your intelligence quotient. It's how smart you are, right? High IQ, you've heard that phrase. But there's another half of that called your emotional quotient, or your EQ. So how are your interpersonal skills? Can you read a room? Do you know how to cheer someone up? Most employers these days lean on a high EQ because IQ, we can teach. We can teach you how to do the job. I can't teach you how to be kind to people, okay? We're gonna review how to give good praise, how to give and receive criticism. We'll talk about different styles of management, and I want you to remember the formula for a successful negotiation. All of that will be tested on at the midterm. So let's go back to organizational climate. This is how your workplace feels, the nature of the relationships at work. Is it positive? Is it warm? Is it healthy? Okay. Or do you hate going into work because it's very toxic or chilly? Okay. We know that employees that rate their climates as warm or healthy are more successful. They're more personally fulfilled by the work they do. But the climate is sort of a strategic decision. The climate can be set from the top down. It's usually built through policies set at the top and then the practices feeling ethical and fair from the bottom. So if the boss sets a rule or, uh, way to do things and the people on the bottom are like, yes, I support that. I can do that. That seems fair. Then you will be more likely to generate a warm, healthy organizational climate because they're both on the same page, right? So remember, it's very strategic. The top down, the people at the top have to figure out what's important to the company, right? How do we get our business model to succeed? And then how can we get our employees to buy in to help us reach that goal? The people at the bottom have to provide feedback. They have to live the policies. They have to communicate when they're unfair. Otherwise, you get a very, very negative climate. Okay. It's also very important for middle management to set the expectations or to model the behavior that they are expecting from their employees. Now, when it comes to hard conversations at work, I want you to remember they're very, very inevitable. They are awkward. They're not fun, but they're super inevitable. I remember telling you that something like 70% of employees will avoid difficult conversations because it's just too much. Absolutely. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I have people that report to me that will go for weeks and weeks and weeks and be bugged because they don't want to have a hard conversation. So knowing that it's so very difficult, how can we do it better? Remember to use I language instead of you language. So I think, I feel, I see. Instead of you failed, you didn't do, you stink at doing things. Okay. Focus your conversation on solving the problem. Okay. You're not there to change their personality. You're there to solve a problem. So if they are not doing what they need to be doing for their job, you have to figure out how to get them to do those things. How can I help you? How can we better work on your time management? How would a change of your schedule help? Things like that. Remember, you need to be honest. Don't manipulate the other people in the conversation. It's very important when you are considering a hard conversation that you sit and I like to physically write down sort of a timeline of facts. So and so did not show up on time on Monday. So and so did not meet these outcomes because, they missed these 3 things. I don't put anything emotional in there. I don't try and tweak the narrative. I only put down the facts. That's what gets you to the solving problems thing. You want to show concern for the other person because we're all humans, right? And we're all trying to genuinely help each other, I hope. You want to respect the equality of the other human. Remember, just because you're the boss and they're the employee, that doesn't make it okay for you to be rude and arrogant and awful to them. What you need to focus on in a hard conversation is getting the other person to the place you need them to be, right? So if that is you need to start showing up on time for your shift, that is the problem you need to solve. So work together to do that. If you are on the other end of that stick, however, you have to be better at responding to criticism. And that is not easy. I mentioned last week, it's a skill that I wish I had because when I get criticized, especially at the workplace, I just do not do well. So a couple of things I've learned. Most people, when they are in a situation of criticism, They will jump into a fight or flight mentality, either justifying their actions. Well, I'm late because of this, that, and the other. Or they just like bail. I have been to so many meetings where we have to talk about a disciplinary issue, and rather than handle that, they pull the flight mentality. They don't show up, they no call, no show, and then they lose their job. You'd be amazed how often that happens. So to avoid that fight or flight mentality, when you start to feel it rising up, you ask for examples, ask for clarity. Guess, but don't assume. Guess what it is that you've done wrong, but don't assume that you're right. Do you have a problem with how I handled this or that or the other? Okay. Always seek more information. I find it good to paraphrase the person who's talking to you. Parrot it back. Say, this is what I'm hearing you say. Is that what you're trying to communicate? And then my catch-all, how would you like that handled next time? How would you like me to do it differently? If the situation comes up again, what would you, prefer I do? It's really, really hard to listen and respond well to criticism. And it's something you have to practice at, which is, it's antithetical, right? Because nobody wants to be criticized. You want to do your job really, really well. But unfortunately, in order to be good at responding to criticism, you're going to have to go through that awful situation a few times. Now, there's a difference between criticism and some negative workplace communication situations, things like incivility. The exchange of seemingly inconsequential, inconsiderate words and deeds that violate conventional standards of workplace conduct. Incivility is a wide spectrum. It can be just insensitive, rude behavior, like checking your messages during a meeting. It can be outward rudeness, like doing name calling. Little things like belittling others, spreading rumors, talking down, things like that, kind of schoolyard stuff. That's kind of what I think of when I think of incivility, okay? Now, a lot of people in the real world would call incivility a gateway crime. We see a lot of incivility as a sort of indicator of a higher problem. So if you see incivility in the workplace, it is likely that that will turn into workplace bullying or harassment sooner than later. Now, speaking of workplace bullying, let's talk about what that looks like. It's a little more dialed in, a little more overt. So with workplace bullying, you're going to see some more intense, ongoing, damaging behaviors. Now, this is going to be severe aggression, like aggressive language, making threats, using fear, using intimidation, things like that. You'll see criticism, but not in a constructive way. Criticism as in nitpicking, things that destroy person's confidence or their competence, making really unreasonable demands when you are the boss that nobody could possibly hit, right? So there's no way for this person to succeed, that kind of thing. We see a little bit of things like deviousness, so going behind someone's back, or spreading terrible gossipy rumors in a really intentional way, things like that. Passive aggressive, dishonest behavior is all deviousness, things like that. And then of course, gatekeeping it's one of my favorites. Controlling the resources. So if somebody continuously denies time off requests, won't give them a raise, things like that, without a really good reason, they're probably bullying through gatekeeping. Remember, there are several different ways you can handle conflict, and what is going to be right for you will depend a lot on how you are viewing the situation as a whole. We walked through each of these last week. Remember, at the top, we have low to high concern for self, low to high concern for other. So how you feel in relation to the other person in the conversation. And that will determine a lot of how you handle that conflict. So if you have a low concern for yourself and a low concern for the other person, you are probably going to be avoiding conflict at all costs, right? But if you have a high concern for yourself and a high concern for the other person, you're probably going to be collaborating really, really well. But compromise is somewhere in the middle. A lot of people tout compromise as the best response, but it's not a true win-win. When you compromise, you have to give something up. So remember, collaboration is always the goal. I want you to review negotiation strategies, the 3 types of outcomes. There is a win-lose, when only one side gets what they want. There's a lose-lose, when there's high expectations and it's competitive and nobody can get what they want. And then, of course, there's win-win, which requires negotiation, a lot of time, a lot of effort, but everybody walks away satisfied. And remember, we negotiate on the daily. You negotiate in small ways all of the time. You come to me for an extension on your assignment, you've initiated a negotiation, okay? When you talk to your friends about what are we doing this weekend, you've initiated a negotiation. Now, negotiation when it comes to conflict is how we get to change the dynamic within the relationship, okay? So when you are trying to have a win-win, especially when we're talking about difficult personalities and conflict, you're going to go through 4 stages. First, identify the ends, okay? So what do both parties want to get out of this? Then we're going to brainstorm all the possible solutions. Get crazy. I love getting crazy with this one. I had 2 employees once, and I was trying to figure out, okay, so let's think about all the possible solutions, right? Well, the other person could go die. Okay, well, that's not helpful, but I'm putting it on the board because it's a brainstorm and I appreciate the effort. And then you go through basically and evaluate, right? Which ones are the most promising? We can scratch 1 or 2 right off the bat. And this is where it gets really collaborative and critical that everybody's working towards a solution that meets everybody's needs. That way we can all come up with a way to feel satisfied with the decision. And then we have to actually implement it and follow up. Make sure everybody understands it and can articulate it. That means tell it back to you. I find it helpful to even put in deadlines, timelines, write up some expectations, and then follow up in a certain amount of time to make sure we're all still on track and following the plan, okay? Okay, so that, my friends, is your midterm review. I just went over like 4 chapters of the textbook in a whopping like 45 minutes. And it's a lot of information, but here's the thing. You guys got this. I am going to open up an extra office hour this week. I will probably send it out in an announcement, or perhaps I'll just reach out to the people that look like they could probably use it the most. That's not a slight or a dig. I'm just trying to think of the best way I can help you be successful. So watch for communication from me. Again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, I am here for you. I am on your team. I want to see you pass this class, okay? It's just all I think about all day long is how I can help you get there. So please feel free to communicate with me in however way you feel comfortable. Call me, text me on my student line, message me through the classroom, send me an email directly, and I'm happy to help you guys get there, okay? All right. Happy midterms. I'm rooting for you. You're going to kill it. I have total faith in you, and we'll see you in week 6, guys.